As I make progress on my coastal journey around Scotland, I'm also prioritizing studies in the studio on the days between hikes. This is a great way to reinforce what I've seen and figure out how to apply what I learned to my paintings. But it's not always straightforward. One of the most common questions I get asked is, how do you know what colors to use for each subject? Well, my friends, the answer is I don't. I make an educated decision based on my past experiences, and then I adjust. Then I look at it some more, see where I'm at, then I adjust again. Take this scene for instance. There is no one right way to paint it. How I see it and paint it will be different to how you see it and paint it. But what we do share is the ability to critique our work. So today I'm going to walk you through my process and talk about how I get through the times in the painting when things just aren't working. Hopefully this will give you some good strategies so that next time you feel stuck, you can work through it too. Let's get started. Lately, I've been thinking about the differences between watercolor and gouache and how it affects my decision making. And the weird thing is, I used to think watercolor was much harder, but now I think because with watercolor you have to plan ahead in your mind a little bit more to preserve the highlights of the paper as the highlights in your painting, you have to make those decisions and move on, and then you're kind of stuck with them. Whereas with gouache, you have the option to layer and layer and layer and make a choice, make a brush stroke, and then change it and go over it over and over and over again. So what I realized is that I actually find myself kind of second guessing my decisions with gouache way more often. Sometimes this leads to kind of stiff paintings or choices that didn't really lead me to the look that I was going for in the end. But with these little studies, I don't have to spend tons of time doing them, and I can do more of them, which means I can learn from my mistakes or my successes more often and move on to the next one. I recommend trying to paint at least 5x7 because what I've found is that painting smaller can sometimes be a lot trickier. You have to distill everything in the painting or the image to very few brush strokes, otherwise it gets overcrowded really easily. So if you have a little bit more space on the paper to spread out, I feel like that allows you to play a little bit more with brush stroke and shapes of things and so much more. Okay, anyways, back to the painting. Before we go any further, I want to say that this first painting did not turn out how I wanted it to. I liked a lot of different parts of it, but in the end, I felt that the rocks just looked way too chaotic. What I was trying to do is simplify all the different areas of the painting and use bigger, more bold application of color. But in the end, I just kept overworking it, and I ended up with so many extra brushstrokes and colors than I originally intended. So after a coffee and a little pout break, I got back to work. I took a photo of the final result and brought it into Photoshop and just painted over it a few times. This was kind of a way of critiquing myself and looking at what would happen if I did X, Y, and Z. So I'll kind of talk you through that process now. Here we have the final result, and I generally liked the sand and the water area, so I decided to focus on the main problem area, which were the rocks. I copy-pasted that into Photoshop and painted over it 3 different times. The first thing I do is squint at what my results look like. And the reason for that is when you squint, you simplify everything, you reduce a lot of the colors, and you can see the values a little bit better. So if you squint at my original painting, you can see the rocks all kind of just blend together, and it's too much of the same thing. There isn't much depth there. So I decided to take part of it, the center section, and make that a little darker to kind of set it back a bit and add a bit more blue reflections to the foreground rocks because there was a lot of blue light bouncing around off of all of the waves and the wet sand. Next, I did basically the same thing, except I left a little bit more of the warm brownish rock color showing through because it wasn't just all gray. So the first one was a little bit too gray. This one, I kind of tried to bridge the gap between those two. And the last one, I used kind of a darker purple tone for the deeper shadows in the middle. I added a bit more saturation to the reflections on the rocks and just made the overall color shapes a little bit more bold. If you compare all of them on the right side while you're squinting, you can see that the top version is the most bold, while the bottom version is kind of all grayed out and just sort of blends together a little bit more than the others. So in my next attempt, I decided to go somewhere between the top two. Now you can either start over or paint over what you've done. There's value in both. If you start over, you get the added benefit of starting fresh and having a nice clean page to work with and clean colors and everything like that. But there's also an advantage to doing a paint over. When you do a paint over, you are mentally allowing yourself to erase whatever you've done. All that hard work you've put in goes out the window, and that's okay. Sometimes we hold our paintings too precious and then we're afraid to make changes. So if you condition yourself to know that just because you're painting over something you've done doesn't mean that it's gone forever, it's just a stepping stone. And I find that the second I make that first brushstroke and paint over something I've done, I'm suddenly free. And I feel like that opens me up to so many new possibilities. And when it comes to layering gouache, my recommendation is to work in thin layers. Glazing with gouache is pretty similar to watercolor, except you can potentially reactivate the color that's below. So I always wait until it's 100% bone dry. You can even use a hairdryer or a heat gun to speed up that process. The other thing with gouache is that the paint will look different when it's wet versus dry. So when you lay a color down, it will sometimes look super different and be much darker or much lighter. And then when it dries, it almost feels like you have a whole different color. So this paint over process with thin layers can be a little bit tedious and time consuming. I find that it's really helpful to have something else to do while I'm waiting for things to dry, like I'll use it as a chance to answer YouTube comments or emails. Otherwise, you can sit there and become really impatient and rush the process. Here, I'm doing my best to kind of match what I was doing in the little digital mock-up when I critiqued myself. The idea is that I want to deepen the rocks in the center area to kind of send them back a bit and shift the color slightly in the foreground rocks and the reflections. And after a couple glazes, I can see that it's still not working. So I took another little break, came back with fresh eyes, and realized that middle section that I'm trying to push back in distance is just too saturated. The browns and purples and blues, all the saturation matches the foreground rocks. The rocks that are supposed to come forward should have a little bit more detail, a little bit more saturation, and I just had way too much blue everywhere. So I decided to do a very thin layer of black mixed with my bluish purple. This desaturates the color and it makes it way darker in value, so it automatically pushes that rock back. I also added a bit of desaturated bluish white to some of the waves and wet sand areas. And finally, things were coming together. I wanted a lot of the energy and movement in the water to be evident in the sand by using tons of different overlapping textures and shapes. But that ever-present danger of overworking things and losing some of that freshness is why I decided to stop at this point. It's enough for me to learn from, and so that next time I sit down and paint rocks or I'm outside, I have more informed decisions to base everything off of. So I hope this video was inspiring and helpful in some way. A thumbs up on the video is always a great way to show your appreciation. And as usual, if you're curious about any of my materials, there is a supplies link in the description. And if you want more real-time tutorials, head on over to my Patreon where I have dozens of watercolor and gouache tutorials. Thank you so much for watching, everyone, and I'll see you again soon. Take care.